Welcome to the channel. Today, we explore the fascinating life and legacy of William Howard Taft, the 27th President and 10th Chief Justice of the United States. From politics to law, his influence shaped American governance in profound ways. Stay tuned as we uncover his journey, impact, and enduring legacy. William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States, 1909 to 1913. Part 1. A Promising Beginning. William Howard Taft was born on September 15, 1857, in the vibrant city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati at the time was a growing industrial hub, a place where ambition and perseverance could take one far. Taft's family was well established and politically connected, which would play a crucial role in shaping his future. His father, Alphonso Taft, was not just a successful attorney but also a dedicated public servant who would go on to serve as the U.S. Attorney General and Secretary of War. His mother, Louisa Torrey Taft, was an intelligent and cultured woman who placed great emphasis on education and moral integrity. From an early age, William was instilled with the values of hard work, public duty, and a disciplined approach to life. The Taft household was intellectually stimulating, with discussions often revolving around law, governance, and ethical responsibility. Unlike some political families that pressured their children into public life, the Tafts encouraged William to find his own path, though his inclination toward leadership was evident from a young age. His father's influence was particularly strong, shaping his early ambition and instilling in him a deep respect for the law. As a student, Taft excelled in academics and showed remarkable diligence. He attended the Woodward High School in Cincinnati, where he was known for his keen intellect and strong work ethic. Unlike many of his peers, he did not possess a flamboyant or extroverted personality. Instead, he was methodical, deliberate, and deeply analytical. His approach to learning and leadership was one of careful consideration, a trait that would define his career in law and politics. His academic excellence led him to Yale University, one of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the country. At Yale, Taft continued to shine, ranking second in his graduating class of 1878. He was not just an exceptional student but also deeply involved in extracurricular activities. He became a member of the secret society Skull and Bones, an elite organization known for fostering connections among the country's future leaders. Taft's time at Yale was transformative. It was here that he further developed his structured approach to problem-solving and governance. While many of his classmates harbored aspirations of becoming politicians, Taft's ambitions leaned toward the judiciary. He saw the law as a means to uphold order and fairness, a belief that would guide his decisions throughout his career. After graduating from Yale, Taft returned to Ohio to study law at the Cincinnati Law School. His choice to return home instead of seeking education at a more nationally recognized institution was a testament to his deep ties to his hometown. He passed the bar in 1880 and quickly embarked on his legal career. His first position was as a local prosecutor in Hamilton County, where he built a reputation for being meticulous, fair, and highly competent. The young lawyer's career progressed rapidly. His ability to analyze cases thoroughly and present clear, well-reasoned arguments caught the attention of prominent legal and political figures. His early years in law reinforced his belief in the importance of a well-structured legal system, one that operated with impartiality and respect for due process. By the time he was 29, Taft had been appointed to the Ohio Superior Court. This was a significant achievement, as it was rare for someone so young to hold such a prestigious judicial position. His time on the bench was marked by his strict adherence to legal principles rather than political considerations. He believed that the judiciary should remain independent and free from the pressures of shifting political landscapes. Even in these early years, those around him recognized that Taft's destiny lay far beyond the Ohio courtroom. His keen legal mind, combined with his dedication to public service, made him a strong candidate for higher office. However, unlike many of his contemporaries, Taft did not actively seek political power. His ambition was not rooted in personal gain but rather in his unwavering belief in the rule of law. Taft's career took another major step forward when he was appointed as Solicitor General of the United States in 1890. This position placed him on the national stage and gave him the opportunity to argue cases before the Supreme Court. His performance was exemplary, and he soon earned a reputation as one of the most competent legal minds in the country. His legal victories were not just a testament to his intelligence, but also to his ability to remain composed under pressure. Unlike many of his peers, Taft was not a fiery orator. He preferred logical reasoning over rhetorical flourish. This approach, while sometimes making him seem less charismatic than other politicians of his time, ensured that he was respected for his intellect and legal insight. Despite his rising profile, Taft remained deeply committed to his family and personal values. In 1886, he married Helen Herron, a woman whose own ambitions complemented his measured approach to public service. Helen, known for her sharp intellect and strong political instincts, played an essential role in encouraging Taft to pursue higher office. Their marriage was a true partnership, one in which Helen's belief in Taft's potential often helped push him beyond his natural reluctance to seek the limelight. As the 1890s progressed, Taft's career trajectory became increasingly intertwined with the broader political landscape of the United States. His steady rise through the ranks of public service was not driven by political maneuvering, but by his consistent demonstration of competence and integrity. Though he remained primarily focused on legal matters, his work as Solicitor General caught the attention of influential figures within the Republican Party. These figures saw in Taft a leader who could bridge the gap between conservative and progressive elements within the party. By the dawn of the 20th century, Taft had established himself as one of the nation's foremost legal minds. His reputation for fairness, combined with his vast experience in both judicial and executive roles, made him a compelling candidate for even higher office. However, Taft himself remained hesitant about entering the world of elected politics. Unlike his future rival Theodore Roosevelt, who thrived on public spectacle and political battles, Taft found greater satisfaction in the quiet but crucial work of governance and legal administration. But destiny had other plans. His deep connections within the Republican Party, his outstanding legal record, and his unwavering integrity meant that he could not remain outside the political arena for long. The coming years would see him take on roles that would not only shape his own legacy but also leave an indelible mark on American history. That concludes Part 1, A Promising Beginning. Let me know if this aligns with your expectations before I move on to Part 2. I can continue with the same depth and detail, ensuring that each part remains rich in content and insight. Part 2, Rising Through the Legal Ranks. William Howard Taft's legal career continued its steady ascent after his early success as a prosecutor in Hamilton County and a judge on the Ohio Superior Court. His reputation for impartiality, deep legal knowledge, and meticulous approach to judicial matters made him an ideal candidate for higher judicial and administrative roles. Unlike many of his contemporaries who actively sought political influence, Taft was content with his role in the legal system, believing that justice and law were the cornerstones of a stable society. His rising prominence in the Ohio judiciary did not go unnoticed at the national level. In 1890, at the age of 32, he was appointed Solicitor General of the United States by President Benjamin Harrison, making him the youngest person to hold the position at the time. The Solicitor General is responsible for representing the federal government before the Supreme Court, an immense responsibility that required not only legal expertise but also the ability to craft persuasive and well-reasoned arguments. Taft embraced the role with diligence and precision. During his tenure, he argued several significant cases before the Supreme Court, reinforcing his reputation as a formidable legal thinker. Unlike some of his peers, who used legal proceedings as a platform for personal or political gain, Taft approached each case with an unwavering commitment to the law, ensuring that the government's interests were represented fairly and ethically. One of his most notable cases was against the American Sugar Refining Company, an antitrust lawsuit that set important precedents for future interpretations of monopoly laws. While trust-busting would later become a central theme of his presidency, Taft's involvement in early antitrust cases as Solicitor General showcased his belief in a fair and regulated economy, free from the undue influence of monopolies. His work as Solicitor General earned him national acclaim and placed him firmly in the upper echelons of the American legal system. However, rather than leveraging his success for political ambition, Taft remained focused on advancing his judicial career. His deep-seated preference for legal matters over electoral politics was evident even when President Harrison nominated him to the newly created position of Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit in 1892. At just 34 years old, Taft's appointment to the Sixth Circuit made him one of the youngest federal judges in the nation. This was a significant leap in his career, granting him the authority to rule on a wide range of legal issues that would shape the development of American jurisprudence. His judicial philosophy was firmly rooted in textualism and constitutional interpretation, believing that the law should be applied as written, rather than being shaped by political considerations. His rulings during his tenure reflected his conservative but fair approach to the law. He believed that the judiciary should serve as a stabilizing force in society, interpreting laws based on legal precedent rather than ideological shifts. This judicial philosophy made him a respected figure within legal circles, even as the broader political landscape in the United States grew more divided. One of his most significant contributions as a federal judge was his work in labor law. At the time, industrialization had led to widespread labor disputes, and courts were frequently asked to intervene in conflicts between business owners and labor unions. Taft's rulings often balanced the interests of both parties, ensuring that neither corporations nor workers were unfairly disadvantaged. A particularly notable case was Veach versus Missouri Pacific Railway Company, where Taft ruled in favor of railway workers seeking fair compensation for workplace injuries. His decision was seen as a landmark ruling in labor rights, demonstrating his belief that workers deserved legal protections without undermining the broader economic framework. His legal reasoning in such cases laid the groundwork for later reforms in labor law, including legislation passed during the Progressive Era. Despite his deep commitment to judicial work, Taft could not escape the growing calls for him to take on greater administrative responsibilities. His ability to mediate complex legal disputes, combined with his reputation for integrity, made him a valuable asset beyond the courtroom. By the late 1890s, his name began circulating among political elites as a potential candidate for even more influential roles in government. It was around this time that Taft first crossed paths with Theodore Roosevelt, a rising political star who would later play a crucial role in shaping Taft's career. Though they had contrasting personalities, Roosevelt being brash and charismatic, while Taft was measured and methodical, the two men shared a mutual respect for public service and legal reform. Their relationship would prove pivotal in the years to come. In 1900, Taft's career took another significant turn when President William McKinley considered him for the position of Governor-General of the Philippines. The United States had recently acquired the Philippines following the Spanish-American War, and the task of establishing governance in the new territory was one of the most challenging assignments in American foreign policy at the time. McKinley believed that Taft's legal expertise, administrative skill, and diplomatic temperament made him the perfect candidate for the role. At first, Taft was hesitant. He had spent his entire career in the judicial system and had no experience in colonial administration. Moreover, he had long harbored aspirations of serving on the Supreme Court, and accepting the post in the Philippines would delay any opportunity for such an appointment. However, after discussing the matter with his wife, Helen, who strongly encouraged him to embrace the challenge, Taft accepted the position. His decision to take on this new role marked a turning point in his career. While he had previously focused on domestic law and judicial responsibilities, his tenure as Governor-General of the Philippines would test his abilities as an executive leader on an international stage. The Philippines was in a volatile state, with resistance movements opposing American rule, and Taft would need to navigate complex political, social, and economic challenges. Before leaving for the Philippines, Taft met with McKinley and key members of his administration to outline his approach. Unlike some of his contemporaries who viewed the Philippines as merely an extension of American power, Taft believed that the United States had a duty to prepare the Filipino people for self-governance. His administration in the Philippines would be characterized by efforts to build infrastructure, establish legal institutions, and implement policies that promoted long-term stability rather than short-term control. As he prepared to embark on this new chapter, Taft understood that his decision to accept the post was not just a career move but a test of his ability to govern effectively. His success, or failure, would shape his future prospects and determine whether he would be considered for even higher offices in the years ahead. The stage was now set for Taft's entrance into international governance, a role that would not only solidify his reputation as an administrator but also position him for his eventual rise to the presidency. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, from political conflicts to infrastructure projects, but Taft was ready to embrace the responsibilities that lay before him. Part 3. Leadership in the Philippines. When William Howard Taft arrived in the Philippines in 1900, he stepped into a land in turmoil. The islands had been ceded to the United States following the Spanish-American War, but the transition to American governance was far from smooth. Filipino revolutionaries, who had fought for independence from Spain, were now resisting American rule, and tensions ran high. The Philippine-American War was still raging, and the U.S. military was struggling to suppress insurgencies that opposed colonial occupation. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed the Philippines as simply another colonial possession, Taft approached his role with a different mindset. He believed that the United States had a moral obligation to prepare the Filipinos for eventual self-governance, rather than merely ruling over them as subjects. His leadership philosophy was rooted in his legal background. He saw governance as a process of institution building, lawmaking, and fostering stability rather than brute force. Even before his departure for the islands, Taft had made it clear to President William McKinley that his primary goal was to establish a civilian government rather than perpetuate military rule. McKinley, recognizing Taft's administrative talent and judicial temperament, supported this vision. When Taft assumed office as the first civilian governor-general of the Philippines in 1901, he immediately began implementing policies that aimed to bring peace and order through governance rather than military occupation. One of Taft's first initiatives was to establish a functioning legal system in the Philippines. He oversaw the creation of a judiciary modeled after American legal principles, ensuring that Filipinos had access to courts that upheld the rule of law. This was a crucial step in gaining the trust of the local population, as it signaled a commitment to justice rather than mere subjugation. He also worked to introduce reforms that protected property rights, stabilized land ownership, and curtailed corruption within local government structures. At the same time, Taft prioritized infrastructure development, recognizing that economic stability was essential for long-term peace. Under his leadership, roads, bridges, and schools were constructed across the islands, improving transportation and education for millions of Filipinos. He firmly believed that education was the key to progress and pushed for the expansion of public schooling, training Filipino teachers, and introducing English as the medium of instruction. However, Taft's leadership was not without controversy. While he sought to implement policies that benefited the Filipino people, he was still operating within the framework of American imperialism. Many Filipino nationalists viewed his efforts as an extension of colonial rule rather than a genuine pathway to independence. The debate over the future of the Philippines was ongoing in both Manila and Washington, with many in the U.S. advocating for prolonged control over the islands. One of Taft's most notable clashes came with U.S. military leaders who believed that a strong military presence was necessary to maintain order. General Arthur MacArthur, the father of future World War II General Douglas MacArthur, had been the military governor of the Philippines before Taft took over. Their differing approaches to governance led to tensions, with MacArthur favoring military solutions while Taft insisted that civilian leadership was the only sustainable path forward. Despite these challenges, Taft remained committed to his mission. He traveled extensively throughout the islands, meeting with local leaders, listening to grievances, and working to integrate Filipinos into the governance process. His personal charm and genuine concern for the well-being of the people helped him earn the respect of many Filipino leaders, even those who initially opposed American rule. Perhaps the most telling example of Taft's approach to leadership was his relationship with Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Filipino resistance. While Aguinaldo had been captured by American forces in 1901, Taft sought to engage with former revolutionaries rather than simply suppress them. He extended offers of amnesty, allowed former insurgents to participate in governance, and worked toward reconciliation rather than perpetual conflict. Taft's tenure as Governor General also saw the implementation of economic reforms aimed at fostering local industry. He encouraged agricultural development, modernized irrigation systems, and worked to attract American investment that would create jobs and infrastructure. Though these efforts had mixed results, they reflected his broader vision of preparing the Philippines for self-sufficiency. One of the more contentious aspects of his administration was the handling of the Catholic Church's vast land holdings in the Philippines. The Catholic Church had long been one of the most powerful institutions in the islands, owning large estates that often led to conflicts with tenant farmers. Taft negotiated a deal in which the U.S. government purchased land from the church and redistributed it to Filipino farmers, attempting to resolve long-standing disputes over land ownership. While this move was praised in some circles, it also faced criticism from both American and Filipino stakeholders who had differing views on the role of the church in governance. Throughout his tenure, Taft remained in close communication with Washington, frequently updating President Theodore Roosevelt, who had assumed office after McKinley's assassination in 1901. Roosevelt, who admired Taft's administrative capabilities, saw him as a valuable ally and often sought his advice on broader matters of governance and policy. In 1903, Taft was offered his lifelong dream, an appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, despite his deep desire to serve on the nation's highest judicial body, he declined the offer. He felt that his work in the Philippines was not yet complete and that his responsibilities as Governor General took precedence over personal ambition. This decision reflected his deep commitment to public service and his belief in seeing his mission through to its conclusion. By 1904, the situation in the Philippines had stabilized significantly. Insurgencies had diminished, the economy was beginning to improve, and American governance had become more structured. Taft believed that he had laid the foundation for long-term progress and began considering his next move. It was at this point that Roosevelt, increasingly reliant on Taft as a trusted advisor, began urging him to return to Washington for a new role. Taft's tenure in the Philippines had solidified his reputation as an effective administrator and a leader who prioritized governance over politics. His ability to mediate conflicts, implement legal reforms, and foster economic growth had demonstrated his capability to handle complex challenges. These qualities would make him an ideal candidate for even greater responsibilities on the national stage. As 1904 drew to a close, Taft received an offer he could not refuse, the position of Secretary of War in Roosevelt's administration. Though he had never aspired to a military role, the position encompassed far more than just defense matters. It gave him oversight of America's growing overseas territories, including the Philippines. Recognizing that this new role would allow him to continue shaping policy on a larger scale, Taft accepted the position and prepared to return to Washington. His years in the Philippines had transformed him from a judge into a statesman. He had navigated one of the most complex assignments in American foreign policy with patience, intelligence, and a steadfast commitment to justice. As he bid farewell to the islands in 1904, he left behind a legacy of reform, infrastructure development, and an evolving vision of Filipino self-governance. However, his journey was far from over. The years ahead would see him rise to even greater heights, culminating in his election as the 27th President of the United States. Part 4. Return to Washington and the Path to the Presidency. William Howard Taft's departure from the Philippines in 1904 marked the end of a significant chapter in his career, but it was also the beginning of a new and even more consequential journey. Having successfully stabilized governance in the islands and demonstrated his administrative prowess, he returned to Washington at the request of President Theodore Roosevelt. Taft had initially envisioned resuming his judicial career, but fate had other plans. Upon his arrival in the capital, Taft was appointed as the Secretary of War, a position that, at first glance, seemed misaligned with his expertise. Unlike Roosevelt, who had a deep fascination with military matters and had personally led the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, Taft had never served in the armed forces. However, Roosevelt had a broader vision for the role, seeing it as a key administrative position that extended beyond military strategy. Taft would be responsible not only for overseeing the armed forces but also for managing America's growing overseas territories, including the Philippines, Cuba, and the Panama Canal Project. Understanding the importance of his new role, Taft immersed himself in the work. His legal and administrative experience made him an effective executive, and his diplomatic skills allowed him to navigate tensions both within the government and abroad. One of his most crucial assignments was the oversight of the construction of the Panama Canal, a project that had faced countless engineering, financial, and diplomatic challenges. Roosevelt saw the canal as essential for expanding American naval power and trade, and he entrusted Taft with ensuring its successful completion. In 1905, Taft traveled to Panama to inspect the progress of the canal. The project was plagued by harsh working conditions, disease outbreaks, and logistical difficulties, but Taft remained committed to its completion. He worked closely with engineers, laborers, and health officials to ensure that the construction process was as efficient and humane as possible. His visit reassured workers and demonstrated his hands-on approach to leadership, a stark contrast to the more flamboyant and aggressive style of Roosevelt. Beyond Panama, Taft was also instrumental in managing U.S. policy in Cuba and the Philippines, frequently advising Roosevelt on governance strategies for these territories. His experience in colonial administration made him an invaluable asset in shaping American imperial policy, and his moderate approach helped maintain stability in volatile regions. While Taft excelled in his role as Secretary of War, his personal aspirations remained unchanged. He still longed for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court, believing that his true calling lay in jurisprudence rather than executive leadership. However, Roosevelt, recognizing Taft's political potential, had different plans. The president saw in Taft a successor who could carry forward his progressive policies while maintaining a steady and moderate approach to governance. Roosevelt's popularity was at its peak following his landslide victory in the 1904 presidential election. However, he had already publicly declared that he would not seek another term in 1908, a decision he would later come to regret. This opened the door for Taft, whom Roosevelt saw as the ideal candidate to continue his legacy. Taft was initially reluctant to pursue the presidency. Unlike Roosevelt, who thrived on public engagement and political maneuvering, Taft found electoral politics exhausting and often distasteful. He disliked the performative aspects of campaigning and preferred administrative and judicial work to the demands of public persuasion. His wife, Helen Herron Taft, however, strongly encouraged him to embrace the opportunity. She had long harbored ambitions of becoming First Lady and saw the presidency as the pinnacle of their shared public life. Despite his reservations, Taft eventually yielded to Roosevelt's persuasion. In 1907, he agreed to become the Republican candidate for the 1908 election. Roosevelt used his immense influence to rally support for Taft, effectively positioning him as his chosen successor. However, despite Roosevelt's backing, Taft faced significant challenges in transitioning from an administrator to a full-fledged political candidate. One of the key obstacles was his lack of charisma compared to Roosevelt. Whereas Roosevelt was known for his energetic speeches, bold rhetoric, and fiery campaign style, Taft was reserved, methodical, and often hesitant in public addresses. His speeches, while thoughtful and intelligent, lacked the dynamism that had made Roosevelt a beloved figure among progressives. This difference in temperament became evident during the campaign, as Taft struggled to generate the same level of enthusiasm among voters. Nevertheless, he had several advantages. As Roosevelt's chosen candidate, he benefited from the outgoing president's immense popularity. The Republican Party was also in a strong position, having dominated national politics for years, and Taft's reputation as a fair and competent administrator reassured conservative and moderate voters. His Democratic opponent, William Jennings Bryan, was running for the presidency for the third time. Bryan, a populist and a brilliant orator, had a devoted following among rural and working-class voters, but his previous losses in 1896 and 1900 had weakened his appeal among the broader electorate. Taft's strategy was to position himself as a steady, experienced leader who would maintain the nation's economic prosperity while continuing Roosevelt's progressive reforms. Throughout the campaign, Roosevelt remained an active supporter, frequently stepping in to defend Taft against criticism and campaigning on his behalf. This level of endorsement from a sitting president was unprecedented, and it played a crucial role in securing Taft's victory. However, it also created an expectation that Taft would govern exactly as Roosevelt had, a burden that would later become a source of tension between the two men. On November 3, 1908, Taft won the presidential election with a comfortable margin, securing 321 electoral votes to Bryan's 162. His victory was largely attributed to Roosevelt's endorsement and the Republican Party's organizational strength. However, while he had won the presidency, the question remained whether he could step out of Roosevelt's shadow and govern with his own distinct vision. As he prepared for his inauguration, Taft faced immense pressure from all sides. Progressives expected him to continue Roosevelt's aggressive reforms, while conservative Republicans hoped he would take a more restrained approach to governance. His own instincts leaned toward judicial reasoning and institutional stability, but he now had to navigate the complexities of executive leadership, a role that demanded political acumen as much as legal expertise. On March 4, 1909, William Howard Taft was sworn in as the 27th President of the United States. His presidency would bring both triumphs and struggles, as he attempted to balance the expectations placed upon him with his own vision of governance. While he had risen to the highest office in the land, his challenges were just beginning. Part 5. The Presidency Begins: Challenges and Early Policies. William Howard Taft assumed the presidency on March 4, 1909, stepping into a role that was both an honor and a burden. Unlike his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, who relished the spotlight and thrived in the rough-and-tumble world of politics, Taft approached the presidency as an administrator rather than a political warrior. He saw the office not as a platform for personal ambition, but as a mechanism for steady governance, law enforcement, and institutional continuity. However, his reserved nature and judicial temperament would soon put him at odds with the political expectations of his time. The inaugural ceremony itself was a sign of the challenges ahead. On the morning of March 4, Washington, D.C., was blanketed in a severe snowstorm. The heavy snow paralyzed the city, forcing organizers to move the swearing-in ceremony indoors to the Senate chamber. While the storm was an inconvenience, some observers saw it as an omen of the turbulent presidency that lay ahead. Taft, however, took the setback in stride, delivering his inaugural address in his characteristic measured and deliberate style. In his speech, Taft pledged to continue many of Roosevelt's progressive reforms while also emphasizing his own priorities. He spoke of tariff reform, the need for a more effective judicial system, and his desire to improve relations with Latin American nations. While he reaffirmed his commitment to enforcing antitrust laws, he did so with a tone of legal precision rather than Roosevelt's fiery rhetoric. This difference in style, though subtle at first, would grow into a defining contrast between the two men. One of the first major issues Taft faced was the contentious issue of tariff reform. The Republican Party had long been divided between high-tariff protectionists, who sought to shield American industries from foreign competition, and low-tariff advocates, who believed in reducing economic barriers to benefit consumers and trade. During his campaign, Taft had promised to revise the tariff system to make it fairer and more efficient. However, as soon as he took office, he found himself entangled in a political battle that tested his leadership. The result of this battle was the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909, a piece of legislation that was supposed to lower tariffs but ultimately failed to meet the expectations of reformers. The bill was heavily influenced by conservative Republicans in Congress, particularly Senator Nelson Aldrich, who represented the interests of big business. While Taft had hoped for a moderate reduction in tariffs, the final version of the bill contained only minor cuts, and in some cases, it actually raised certain duties. This outcome angered progressives, who had expected more substantial reform, and marked the beginning of Taft's growing estrangement from the progressive wing of his party. In a move that would later haunt him, Taft publicly defended the Payne-Aldrich tariff, calling it the best tariff bill that the Republican Party has ever passed. This statement alienated many reformers, who saw it as a betrayal of Roosevelt's legacy. Although Taft had not been the bill's primary architect, His defense of it solidified the perception that he was aligning with conservative interests rather than progressive change. The controversy over the tariff was the first major blow to his presidency, signaling that he would struggle to maintain the broad coalition that had helped elect him. Beyond tariff reform, Taft sought to continue Roosevelt's antitrust policies, albeit with a different approach. Whereas Roosevelt had used the presidency as a bully pulpit to publicly attack monopolies and big corporations, Taft preferred a quieter, more legalistic strategy. He believed in enforcing the law through the courts rather than using executive power to pressure businesses into compliance. This method was less dramatic but, in some ways, even more effective. Under his administration, more antitrust cases were filed than during Roosevelt's entire tenure, targeting powerful corporate entities such as Standard Oil and American Tobacco. Despite his efforts, Taft's antitrust policies failed to win him the same level of public admiration that Roosevelt had enjoyed. Because he lacked Roosevelt's flair for public engagement, many Americans did not fully appreciate the extent of his trust-busting efforts. Instead of being seen as a strong enforcer of economic fairness, he was often portrayed as a passive administrator who lacked the dynamism needed to lead a progressive movement. Another major challenge Taft faced in his early presidency was the growing tension within the Republican Party. The divide between conservatives and progressives had been simmering for years, but it became more pronounced under his leadership. Progressives, inspired by Roosevelt's activism, wanted bold reforms on issues such as labor rights, conservation, and corporate regulation. Conservatives, on the other hand, sought to curb what they saw as excessive government intervention in the economy. Taft, who naturally gravitated toward legal reasoning and institutional stability, often found himself caught in the middle of these competing factions. One of the most symbolic and controversial moments of this internal struggle was the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Gifford Pinchot, the head of the U.S. Forest Service and a close ally of Roosevelt, was a passionate advocate for conservation. He had played a key role in expanding national parks and protecting public lands from exploitation by private interests. However, during Taft's presidency, Pinchot came into conflict with Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior. Ballinger was more sympathetic to business interests and was accused by progressives of being too lenient in allowing corporate development on public lands. When Pinchot publicly criticized Ballinger and accused him of corruption, Taft was forced to take action. Instead of siding with the conservationists, Taft dismissed Pinchot from his position, arguing that his insubordination warranted removal. This decision infuriated Roosevelt and his supporters, who saw it as a direct attack on the progressive movement. The Ballinger-Pinchot affair became a major scandal, further deepening the rift between Taft and Roosevelt's political allies. As Taft's presidency progressed, it became increasingly clear that he was struggling to bridge the gap between different factions of the Republican Party. His commitment to legalistic governance, while effective in some areas, often left him politically isolated. He was not a natural coalition builder, and his reluctance to engage in the kind of public spectacle that Roosevelt had mastered made it difficult for him to rally widespread support. Despite these challenges, Taft continued to pursue a number of important reforms, including improvements in railroad regulation, the expansion of postal savings banks, and efforts to strengthen the federal court system. However, his presidency was becoming overshadowed by the growing perception that he was out of step with the progressive wave that was sweeping through American politics. As 1910 approached, tensions within the Republican Party reached a breaking point. Roosevelt, who had initially supported Taft as his successor, began to express dissatisfaction with his policies. The former president, who had enjoyed a post-presidency tour of Africa and Europe, returned to the United States to find a political landscape that he believed was moving in the wrong direction. Seeing Taft's alignment with conservative interests, Roosevelt began to reconsider his decision to step away from active politics. This set the stage for one of the most dramatic political battles in American history, a battle that would not only define the remainder of Taft's presidency but also reshape the future of the Republican Party. The friendship and alliance between Roosevelt and Taft, once unshakable, was now on the brink of collapse. Part 6. The Breaking Point, Taft versus Roosevelt and the 1912 election. By the time William Howard Taft entered the second half of his presidency, the political landscape had grown increasingly turbulent. What had once been a firm alliance between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt had deteriorated into one of the most bitter political rivalries in American history. The Republican Party, which had been a dominant force in national politics for decades, was now fracturing under the weight of competing ideologies. As the 1912 presidential election approached, the battle between Taft and Roosevelt would not only define their legacies but also reshape the entire political system. The rift between Taft and Roosevelt did not happen overnight. When Roosevelt left office in 1909, he fully expected Taft to carry forward his progressive policies while also maintaining the stability of conservative Republican governance. However, Taft's leadership style and priorities soon diverged from Roosevelt's vision. While Taft saw himself as a guardian of constitutional law and institutional integrity, Roosevelt believed in a more aggressive use of presidential power to advance social and economic reforms. One of the earliest signs of tension between them was Taft's approach to trust-busting. Although Taft had prosecuted more antitrust cases than Roosevelt, his methods lacked the public spectacle that Roosevelt had so effectively used to rally support. Taft relied on the legal system to break up monopolies, believing that courts should handle economic regulation rather than the executive branch. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had used the presidency as a platform to publicly pressure corporations into compliance, creating the impression that he was personally responsible for reining in corporate excesses. This difference in strategy led Roosevelt to believe that Taft was not truly committed to progressive ideals. However, the breaking point in their relationship came with the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Gifford Pinchot, a devoted conservationist and one of Roosevelt's closest allies, had been a leading figure in protecting public lands from corporate exploitation. When Taft dismissed Pinchot after his public accusations against Richard Ballinger, the move was seen as a betrayal of Roosevelt's conservationist agenda. Although Taft believed he was simply enforcing executive discipline, Roosevelt and his supporters viewed it as a sign that Taft was siding with business interests over progressive reform. The controversy widened the gap between them, turning what had once been a friendship into a deep ideological divide. By 1910, Roosevelt had returned from his post-presidency travels and began speaking out more openly against Taft's administration. Initially, he refrained from direct attacks, but as he saw the Republican Party drifting toward conservatism, he became increasingly vocal. His speeches, particularly his New Nationalism address in Osawatomie, Kansas, signaled his return to political activism. In this speech, he called for a more powerful federal government to regulate industry, protect workers' rights, and promote social justice. Ideas that went far beyond the reforms Taft was willing to endorse. Roosevelt's growing public presence set the stage for an inevitable confrontation between the two former allies. By early 1912, Roosevelt made his most dramatic political move yet. He declared his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination, directly challenging Taft for leadership of the party. This was an extraordinary and unprecedented decision. No former president had ever attempted to return to the White House after voluntarily stepping down, and certainly not at the expense of his own hand-picked successor. However, Roosevelt believed that Taft had failed to carry forward the progressive movement, and he was determined to reclaim the presidency to implement his bold reform agenda. Taft was deeply hurt by Roosevelt's challenge. He had always admired Roosevelt and had considered him a mentor and friend. However, he was also determined not to simply step aside. Unlike Roosevelt, Taft saw the presidency as an institution governed by laws and traditions rather than personal charisma and direct public appeal. He was reluctant to campaign in the populist style that Roosevelt had mastered, preferring instead to rely on party loyalty and institutional support. This difference in campaign strategy would ultimately prove to be a disadvantage for Taft. The battle for the Republican nomination was one of the most intense and dramatic in American political history. Roosevelt, drawing on his immense popularity, launched a vigorous campaign, traveling across the country and delivering fiery speeches that energized progressive voters. He won a series of primary contests, particularly in states where the Republican electorate had a strong progressive base. However, at the time, primary elections were still a relatively new and limited aspect of the nomination process. the real power still lay with the party establishment and the Republican National Convention, where Taft had significant control over delegates. Despite Roosevelt's success in the primaries, Taft's allies used their influence to secure his nomination at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. This outcome enraged Roosevelt and his supporters, who believed that the nomination had been stolen through backroom political maneuvering. In response, Roosevelt made another unprecedented move. He broke away from the Republican Party and formed his own political organization, the Progressive Party, which became popularly known as the Bull Moose Party. The name originated from Roosevelt's own declaration that he felt as strong as a bull moose, reflecting his confidence and determination. The creation of the Progressive Party marked the official split of the Republican Party, making the 1912 election a three-way contest between Taft, Roosevelt, and the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. With Roosevelt leading the charge for progressives and Taft representing the conservative wing of the party, the division all but guaranteed that the Republicans would struggle to retain the presidency. As the general election campaign unfolded, it became clear that Taft was in an untenable position. Roosevelt's dynamic presence and aggressive campaigning attracted the majority of progressive voters who had once supported the Republican Party. Meanwhile, Wilson, a reform-minded Democrat with his own progressive platform, appealed to many moderates and independents who might have otherwise considered supporting Taft. This left Taft with only the support of the most conservative faction of the Republican base, significantly weakening his electoral prospects. On Election Day, the results confirmed what many had predicted. Taft suffered a devastating defeat. Woodrow Wilson won the presidency with a landslide victory, securing 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt, despite running as a third-party candidate, managed to win 88 electoral votes, an extraordinary feat for a non-traditional party. Taft, the sitting president, won only 8 electoral votes, making it one of the most crushing losses for an incumbent in American history. The 1912 election was a defining moment in U.S. political history. It not only ended Taft's presidency but also marked the beginning of a new era of political realignment. The Republican Party had been fractured, progressivism had solidified as a dominant force in American politics, and Roosevelt had demonstrated that a third-party challenge could reshape the national conversation. For Taft, the loss was both a personal and political blow. He had never aspired to be a career politician, and the brutal nature of the campaign had left him disillusioned with electoral politics. However, while his presidency had ended in disappointment, his public service career was far from over. In the years that followed, he would find a new path, one that would bring him greater personal fulfillment and allow him to finally achieve his lifelong dream. Part 7. Life After the Presidency. A Return to Law and Public Service. The crushing defeat of 1912 left William Howard Taft deeply shaken. For a man who had never truly sought the presidency in the first place, the bitter political battles, the betrayal of former allies, and the public humiliation of his electoral loss were deeply painful. While his natural disposition had always been more suited to law and administration than to the rough-and-tumble world of partisan politics, the experience of the presidency had only reinforced his belief that he was never meant to be a politician in the Rooseveltian sense. Unlike Roosevelt, who thrived on public adoration and the drama of the campaign trail, Taft found no joy in the endless battles for power and influence. With his presidency now behind him, he was eager to leave politics altogether and return to the field where he had always been happiest: law. After departing the White House in March 1913, Taft wasted little time in re-establishing his legal career. He accepted a position as a professor of constitutional law at Yale University, a role that allowed him to immerse himself in legal scholarship while also mentoring the next generation of legal minds. The transition from the pressures of the presidency to the quiet intellectual environment of academia was a welcome relief. At Yale, Taft found himself surrounded by students who respected his legal knowledge rather than political operatives seeking to manipulate his decisions. The shift suited his temperament perfectly, and he quickly became a beloved figure on campus. Despite his withdrawal from the political arena, Taft remained an important public voice on legal and constitutional matters. He wrote extensively on the role of the judiciary, the separation of powers, and the limits of executive authority. issues that had shaped his presidency and continued to define his worldview. He frequently spoke about the dangers of populist demagoguery and the need for a stable, impartial legal system. While his warnings were often seen as a veiled critique of Roosevelt's more activist approach to government, Taft generally avoided direct attacks on his former friend and rival. Instead, he focused on reinforcing his vision of governance, one that placed the rule of law above personal ambition or political expediency. As the years passed, Taft remained active in public service in a variety of roles. In 1914, he became president of the American Bar Association, using his influence to promote legal education and judicial reform. He was also involved in international legal discussions, advocating for arbitration as a means of resolving conflicts between nations. His views on diplomacy and global law reflected his long-standing belief that rational negotiation and legal frameworks were preferable to military intervention and power struggles. Despite his personal distaste for electoral politics, Taft did not completely withdraw from political affairs. During World War I, he became a vocal advocate for American preparedness and later for the creation of a lasting international framework for peace. Though he did not always agree with President Woodrow Wilson's policies, he supported the general idea of an international organization to prevent future conflicts. However, Taft's vision of international law was more pragmatic than Wilson's idealistic vision of the League of Nations. While Wilson sought a broad and sweeping global institution, Taft favored a more limited approach that emphasized legal arbitration and judicial oversight. The post-war years also saw Taft play an important role in domestic political debates. Although he had been soundly defeated in 1912, the Republican Party gradually began to reconcile its internal divisions. The progressive faction that Roosevelt had led began to wane after his death in 1919, and by the early 1920s, the party had largely returned to its conservative roots. While Taft never sought elected office again, he was once again a respected figure within Republican circles, particularly among those who valued legal stability and institutional governance. In 1921, Taft finally achieved the lifelong dream that had eluded him for so many years. President Warren G. Harding, a fellow Ohioan and longtime admirer of Taft, nominated him to serve as Chief Justice of the United States. The nomination was swiftly confirmed by the Senate, marking the culmination of Taft's career and the realization of his deepest professional aspiration. Unlike the presidency, which had often frustrated him, the role of Chief Justice was a perfect fit for his skills, temperament, and intellectual inclinations. As Chief Justice, Taft brought a steady hand to the Supreme Court, working tirelessly to modernize the judicial system and improve the efficiency of court procedures. He introduced reforms to streamline the court's operations, advocated for the construction of a separate Supreme Court building to establish judicial independence from Congress, and played a key role in shaping legal doctrine during his tenure. His legal philosophy was rooted in pragmatism and judicial restraint, emphasizing stability and continuity over sweeping changes or judicial activism. One of his most significant contributions as Chief Justice was his role in the landmark case of Myers v. United States, 1926. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the President had the authority to remove executive branch officials without Senate approval. The decision reinforced the separation of powers and clarified the limits of legislative interference in executive appointments. Taft, who authored the majority opinion, saw the ruling as an important affirmation of executive authority within constitutional boundaries. Despite the demands of the position, Taft relished his work on the Supreme Court. He frequently expressed how much happier he was as Chief Justice than he had ever been as President. In one of his letters, he famously wrote, "I don't remember that I was ever President." This statement, while somewhat humorous, reflected his genuine belief that his true calling had always been the law, not politics. By the late 1920s, however, Taft's health began to decline. He suffered from a number of ailments, including heart disease and high blood pressure, exacerbated by his lifelong struggles with obesity. Despite these health issues, he continued to fulfill his duties as Chief Justice for as long as he could, determined to remain active in the work that he loved. However, by early 1930, it became clear that he could no longer continue. His condition worsened, and he reluctantly stepped down from the Supreme Court in February of that year. Just over a month later, on March 8, 1930, William Howard Taft passed away at the age of 72. His death marked the end of a long and distinguished career in public service, one that had spanned multiple branches of government and left a lasting impact on American law and governance. Unlike most former presidents, whose legacies are defined primarily by their time in the White House, Taft's greatest contributions came after his presidency, in the role he had always wanted, Chief Justice of the United States. In the years since his passing, Taft's legacy has been remembered not just for his presidency, but for his unique place in American history as the only person to have served as both President and Chief Justice. His tenure on the Supreme Court is often regarded as one of the most effective and stabilizing in modern history, and his commitment to legal integrity continues to be studied by scholars and legal minds alike. With his passing, Taft left behind a legacy of dedication to the rule of law, institutional reform, and the belief that government should be guided by reason rather than political expediency. While his presidency may not have been marked by the same dramatic flair as those of Roosevelt or Wilson, his impact on the American judicial system remains profound and enduring. Part 8. Taft as Chief Justice, Shaping the Supreme Court and Judicial Reform. William Howard Taft's appointment as Chief Justice of the United States in 1921 was more than just a career milestone. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. For years, Taft had openly expressed his desire to serve on the Supreme Court, believing that his true calling was in the judiciary rather than in politics. Unlike the presidency, which had often left him feeling frustrated and constrained, the role of Chief Justice allowed him to apply his deep legal knowledge, administrative skills, and institutional mindset to a position that was perfectly suited to his strengths. He was not only the first and only former president to serve as Chief Justice, but he also became one of the most consequential leaders of the Supreme Court in the early 20th century. Upon taking office, Taft found the Supreme Court in need of significant reform. The judicial system was plagued by inefficiencies, backlogged cases, and an outdated administrative structure. The federal courts were overburdened, and the Supreme Court itself was struggling to manage its growing caseload. Determined to modernize the judiciary, Taft wasted no time in implementing changes that would improve both the efficiency and effectiveness of the courts. His tenure was marked by sweeping administrative reforms, efforts to strengthen judicial independence, and key rulings that shaped the interpretation of constitutional law. One of Taft's top priorities as Chief Justice was to secure a permanent home for the Supreme Court. At the time, the court had no separate building of its own and operated out of the United States Capitol, sharing space with Congress. This arrangement, in Taft's view, undermined the judiciary's independence and symbolic standing as a co-equal branch of government. He believed that the Supreme Court needed its own headquarters to emphasize its distinct role in interpreting the Constitution and ensuring the rule of law. Taft personally lobbied Congress to approve the construction of a dedicated Supreme Court building, arguing that such a structure would not only provide the justices with a dignified working environment, but also reinforce the public's perception of the judiciary as an independent institution. His efforts were ultimately successful, and in 1929, Congress approved the construction of the Supreme Court building. Although Taft did not live to see its completion in 1935, the building remains one of his most enduring legacies, serving as a physical testament to his vision for a stronger and more independent judiciary. Beyond administrative reforms, Taft also played a crucial role in shaping the legal doctrines of the time. He believed in judicial restraint and was committed to maintaining stability in constitutional interpretation. Unlike some of his successors who would later push for more activist rulings, Taft was a firm believer in upholding precedents and avoiding sweeping judicial changes that might disrupt established legal principles. He saw the judiciary's role as one of careful deliberation rather than dramatic intervention. One of the most significant cases during Taft's tenure was Myers v. United States, 1926, which addressed the issue of executive power in removing government officials. The case centered on whether the president had the authority to remove postmasters without Senate approval, a question that had implications for the separation of powers. Taft, who authored the majority opinion, ruled that the president did indeed have the power to remove executive officials without congressional interference. His reasoning was rooted in the Constitution's grant of executive authority, arguing that limitations on this power would disrupt the efficient functioning of government. The decision reinforced the principle of executive independence and remains an important precedent in discussions of presidential authority. Another significant case during Taft's tenure was Olmstead v. United States, 1928, which dealt with the use of wiretapped phone conversations as evidence in criminal trials. The case raised fundamental questions about privacy rights and the interpretation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. In a controversial 5-4 decision, the court ruled that wiretapping did not constitute an illegal search since no physical trespass had occurred. Taft joined the majority in upholding the government's use of wiretaps, arguing that technological advancements did not necessarily change the legal understanding of search and seizure. However, the case later became notable for Justice Louis Brandeis's famous dissent, which anticipated modern debates on privacy in the digital age. While Taft's opinion reflected the legal thinking of his time, later courts would take a different view, ultimately overturning the precedent in the 1967 case Katz v. United States. In addition to his judicial work, Taft remained committed to broader legal reforms that would improve the efficiency of the courts. One of his most important achievements in this area was his successful push for the Judges' Bill of 1925, which significantly changed the way cases reached the Supreme Court. Prior to this reform, the court was required to hear a large number of cases on appeal, leading to an overwhelming backlog. The new law, which Taft championed, allowed the Supreme Court to exercise greater discretion in selecting which cases it would hear, giving the justices more control over their docket and improving the overall efficiency of the judicial process. This reform remains a foundational aspect of the modern Supreme Court's case selection process. Taft's leadership extended beyond the Supreme Court itself. He played a key role in advocating for judicial salaries, working conditions, and resources that would enable federal judges to perform their duties effectively. He also worked to promote professionalism within the legal profession, emphasizing the importance of ethical conduct and judicial impartiality. His tenure helped establish the modern framework of the federal judiciary, shaping its structure in ways that continue to influence the American legal system today. Despite his many accomplishments as Chief Justice, Taft's later years were increasingly marked by declining health. His struggles with obesity, high blood pressure, and heart disease worsened over time, making it difficult for him to keep up with the demands of the court. By the late 1920s, his condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer fully carry out his responsibilities. Though he was reluctant to step down, he ultimately recognized that his declining health was interfering with his ability to serve effectively. In February 1930, he formally resigned from the Supreme Court, bringing an end to his long and distinguished career in public service. Just weeks after his resignation, Taft passed away on March 8, 1930, at the age of 72. His death marked the loss of a statesman whose contributions spanned both the executive and judicial branches of government. Unlike his tenure as president, which had been marked by political struggles and disappointments, his time as Chief Justice was widely regarded as a success. He had brought stability, reform, and modernization to the federal judiciary, leaving behind a legal legacy that would endure for generations. In recognition of his service, Taft was given the rare honor of a state funeral, attended by political leaders, members of the judiciary, and legal scholars who respected his contributions to American governance. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, becoming the first president to be laid to rest there. His final resting place symbolizes the unique position he held in American history, as both a leader of the nation and a steward of its legal system. Today, William Howard Taft's legacy is often overshadowed by more charismatic figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. However, his impact on the judiciary and his efforts to strengthen the institutional foundations of government remain profound. He was a man who valued reason over rhetoric, law over politics, and stability over spectacle. While his presidency may not have been defined by sweeping reforms or grand gestures, his leadership as Chief Justice ensured that the legal foundations of the nation were preserved and strengthened for future generations. Part 9. Taft's Legal Philosophy and Lasting Influence on American Governance. William Howard Taft's contributions to American governance extended far beyond the roles he occupied. As both the 27th President of the United States and the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he left an enduring mark on the legal and institutional fabric of the nation. While his presidency was often viewed as cautious and constrained by political pressures, his judicial tenure was marked by a clear, pragmatic vision for the rule of law. His legal philosophy was deeply rooted in judicial restraint, constitutional stability, and the belief that the courts should interpret rather than create law. These principles not only defined his decisions on the Supreme Court but also influenced the broader evolution of American jurisprudence. At the heart of Taft's judicial philosophy was his unwavering commitment to the principle of judicial restraint. Unlike some of his contemporaries who saw the judiciary as a vehicle for progressive change, Taft firmly believed that courts should avoid activism and instead adhere strictly to precedent. He was deeply skeptical of judges who sought to expand the scope of constitutional interpretation to align with contemporary social or political movements. In his view, the role of the judiciary was not to legislate from the bench but to uphold the original intent of the Constitution and ensure that laws were applied consistently. This perspective placed him at odds with more activist-minded justices like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, who advocated for a more flexible and evolving interpretation of the law. Taft's emphasis on constitutional stability was evident in many of the key rulings during his tenure as Chief Justice. He frequently warned against judicial overreach, arguing that courts should not interfere with legislative and executive decisions unless there was a clear constitutional violation. His rulings often reflected a deep respect for institutional boundaries, reinforcing the idea that governance should be carried out through established legal mechanisms rather than through judicial intervention. This conservative approach to constitutional interpretation would later influence judicial figures in the mid to late 20th century, particularly those who championed originalism and textualism. One of Taft's most significant contributions to American governance was his work in shaping the administrative structure of the federal judiciary. When he assumed the role of Chief Justice in 1921, the judicial system was struggling under the weight of outdated processes and a growing backlog of cases. Recognizing the urgent need for reform, Taft pushed for changes that would streamline the judicial process and enhance the efficiency of the courts. His efforts culminated in the Judges' Bill of 1925, which fundamentally transformed the way the Supreme Court handled cases. By giving the court greater control over its docket, this law allowed the justices to focus on the most significant constitutional issues rather than being overwhelmed by routine appeals. The impact of this reform was profound, shaping the modern function of the Supreme Court and solidifying its role as the final arbiter of constitutional questions. Beyond judicial reform, Taft was also a strong advocate for the separation of powers and the proper balance between the three branches of government. His presidency had been marked by conflicts with Congress and the progressive movement, which sought to expand executive authority in unprecedented ways. While he did not oppose strong leadership, he believed that presidential power should be exercised within the limits set by the Constitution. His stance on executive power was most clearly articulated in Myers v. United States, 1926, in which he ruled that the president had the authority to remove executive officials without Senate approval. This decision reinforced the independence of the executive branch while also clarifying the limits of congressional influence over administrative appointments. Taft's views on executive power were shaped by his own experiences in the White House. Unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who had embraced a broad and energetic interpretation of presidential authority, Taft took a far more measured approach. He believed that unchecked executive power could lead to instability and that it was the duty of the judiciary to ensure that the president remained within constitutional boundaries. This philosophy would later serve as a guiding principle for conservative legal scholars and justices who sought to limit the expansion of executive authority in the modern era. In addition to his judicial and administrative reforms, Taft also played a key role in shaping international law and diplomacy. While he was not directly involved in foreign affairs during his tenure as Chief Justice, his earlier advocacy for legal arbitration as an alternative to war remained an important part of his legacy. During his presidency, he had supported efforts to strengthen international legal institutions, believing that disputes between nations should be resolved through arbitration rather than military conflict. His views in this area were ahead of their time and would later influence the creation of bodies such as the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. Despite his many accomplishments, Taft's legal philosophy was not without its critics. Some argued that his rigid adherence to judicial restraint prevented the courts from addressing pressing social and economic issues. In an era marked by rapid industrialization, labor disputes, and growing demands for civil rights, there were those who believed that the judiciary had a moral obligation to intervene in cases of injustice. Taft, however, maintained that the courts were not meant to be instruments of social change, but rather guardians of legal continuity. His belief in gradual, institutionally driven reform rather than sweeping judicial activism remains a subject of debate among legal historians. As the 20th century progressed, Taft's legal philosophy continued to influence American jurisprudence. His emphasis on judicial restraint and constitutional stability became central to the thinking of later conservative justices, particularly during the latter half of the century. Figures such as Chief Justice William Rehnquist and Justice Antonin Scalia echoed many of Taft's views on the importance of precedent and the dangers of judicial activism. His legacy can also be seen in the continued operation of the Supreme Court's case selection process, which remains structured around the principles established by the Judges' Bill of 1925. Taft's impact on governance was not limited to the judiciary. His presidency, while often overshadowed by his judicial career, had also contributed to the shaping of federal administration and executive decision-making. His cautious approach to economic regulation, his belief in tariff stability, and his emphasis on legal order all helped lay the foundation for later conservative approaches to governance. While he lacked the political charisma of Roosevelt or the progressive zeal of Wilson, his steady, methodical approach to leadership left a lasting imprint on American institutions. By the time of his death in 1930, Taft had cemented his place as one of the most unique figures in American history. No other individual had ever served as both President and Chief Justice, and few had left such a profound impact on the structure of government and the judiciary. His contributions were not always recognized in his own time, but history has increasingly acknowledged his role in shaping the legal and institutional landscape of the United States. Today, his legacy lives on in the principles of judicial restraint, the efficiency of the federal courts, and the enduring independence of the Supreme Court. Part 10. The Legacy of William Howard Taft, Historical Perception and Modern Relevance. William Howard Taft's legacy is one of quiet yet profound influence. Unlike his immediate predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, or his successor, Woodrow Wilson, Taft never inspired a devoted following or captured the public imagination with soaring rhetoric and grand visions. Instead, his contributions to American governance were defined by institutional reform, legal precision, and a deep respect for constitutional principles. Though often overshadowed by more charismatic leaders, Taft's impact on the presidency, the judiciary, and American political thought remained significant. For much of the 20th century, historical assessments of Taft tended to emphasize his limitations rather than his accomplishments. His presidency was frequently characterized as cautious, uninspired, and overshadowed by Roosevelt's dynamic leadership. Many early historians viewed him as a man who had reluctantly assumed the presidency and struggled to assert himself amid the growing tensions of the progressive era. His break with Roosevelt in 1912, which led to one of the most dramatic electoral defeats in American history, further cemented the perception of Taft as a political figure who lacked the ability to unite a broad coalition. However, as historical scholarship evolved, so too did the interpretation of Taft's presidency. More recent historians have reassessed his tenure with a greater appreciation for the complexity of his leadership and the durability of his policies. While he may not have been a transformational president in the way that Roosevelt or Wilson were, Taft played a crucial role in stabilizing the federal government at a time of rapid social and economic change. His approach to antitrust enforcement, while different from Roosevelt's, laid the groundwork for a more systematic and legally sound approach to corporate regulation. His commitment to judicial independence and legal order reinforced the rule of law during a period of significant political turmoil, and his efforts to reform the administrative structure of the executive branch helped shape the modern presidency. Taft's legacy as Chief Justice, by contrast, has been consistently regarded as one of great achievement. His tenure on the Supreme Court was marked by significant judicial reforms, key legal precedents, and a lasting impact on the structure of the federal judiciary. His leadership in securing a permanent Supreme Court building, his role in modernizing the court's case selection process, and his efforts to strengthen the efficiency of the judicial system all contributed to his reputation as one of the most effective Chief Justices in American history. Unlike his presidency, which was often defined by political conflict, his time on the court allowed him to fully utilize his legal expertise in a way that aligned with his strengths. One of the most enduring aspects of Taft's legacy is his emphasis on institutional stability. Throughout his career, he consistently sought to reinforce the structures of government, ensuring that they operated within the framework of the Constitution. His legal philosophy, which prioritized judicial restraint and adherence to precedent, has continued to influence the judiciary in the decades since his tenure. Many of the principles he championed, such as the importance of an independent judiciary, the balance of powers between branches of government, and the need for a non-political Supreme Court, remain central to contemporary debates about the role of the courts in American democracy. Taft's influence can also be seen in the broader trajectory of the conservative legal movement. His belief that the courts should interpret rather than create law, his skepticism of judicial activism, and his commitment to legal order all foreshadowed later developments in American jurisprudence. Many of the ideas that would later be embraced by conservative justices in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, such as originalism, textualism, and the limited role of the judiciary in social policy, can be traced back to the principles Taft upheld during his time on the Supreme Court. Despite his many accomplishments, Taft remains one of the more underappreciated figures in American history. He is often remembered more for his size and his supposed discomfort with the presidency than for his substantive contributions to governance. The popular image of Taft, frequently reduced to anecdotes about his weight or his uneasy relationship with Roosevelt, has often obscured the depth of his impact. Yet, for those who study his career closely, a different picture emerges. He was a dedicated public servant, a skilled legal thinker, and a stabilizing force in American politics during an era of rapid change. In many ways, Taft's legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of institutional leadership. While he may not have been a bold visionary in the mold of Roosevelt or Wilson, he was an effective steward of the government, ensuring that its structures remained strong and functional. His contributions to the legal system, his emphasis on the rule of law, and his commitment to judicial reform continue to shape the United States today. Ultimately, the story of William Howard Taft is one of quiet but enduring influence. His presidency may not have been revolutionary, but it was marked by a steady hand and a deep respect for constitutional order. His tenure as Chief Justice, by contrast, was one of lasting significance, shaping the modern Supreme Court and reinforcing the foundations of American jurisprudence. While he never sought the spotlight, his work ensured that the institutions of government remained stable and resilient, a legacy that continues to be felt long after his time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of William Howard Taft. His impact on American governance, law, and institutions remains significant. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more insightful content. See you next time.